Fintech and crypto compliance and regulation. Why you should care.
Perfect, thank you. So welcome to everyone in the audience who's here right now. And thank you, Camille, for filling up the room slightly, a bit late in the afternoon. So this afternoon, we will be speaking about the dynamic and semi-turbulent, ever-evolving regulatory landscape of crypto and fintech. So MiCA's here. There's around 55 operators who have a CASP license in Europe, and several others who are currently in transition in some way or form, or have submitted their CASP application. So the race is on to become authorized under MiCA, and the deadline is June 2026, so quite soon. But will everyone make it, given the deadline, especially given that thousands of operators are operating under some AML registration regime? Are things actually moving? What is actually going on behind the scenes? So to discuss this very hot topic, we have an all-women's panel, which is very great, not very common. And with me to discuss, I have Maruska Buttigieg, who's the Chief Compliance Officer at FalconX, which is a digital assets prime brokerage registered in Malta. Not sure if you're VFA or MiCA yet, so and then perhaps...
Still VFA.
Still VFA, transitioning to MiCA. We have Galyna Podoprikhina. Correct me what you're saying, I'm very sorry, it's a bit complicated. Senior Associate at WH, which is a law firm here in Malta. We have Delphine Forma, who is the Head of Policy at Solidus Labs, which is an AI-powered compliance platform focusing on trade surveillance and transaction monitoring. So all women in the crypto space working in various capacities, some client-facing, some B2B, some advisory, some compliance. And we'll just dive into the questions. So first question, what is your perception of the current state of play of MiCA from where you are sitting in your everyday roles, where you work and advise? What are some of the current challenges you or your clients are facing? So Maruska, Galyna.
Yep. So I am part of the private sector who are implementing MiCA on a day-to-day basis. We are transitioning our license from the Malta regime to the EU regime. I have to confess that when I started this journey 2.5 years ago, I thought that the transition for MiCA was going to be quite easy. When I read the level 1 regulation, I said, okay, no big deal. This is very much like the VFA framework that we currently have. And almost some of the requirements have been dropped. Little did I know that when I started reading level 2, level 3, all those RTSs, all these guidelines, all these opinions, my opinion started changing drastically. And I confess that every day it's a new challenge. It's not as easy as we thought it's going to be, especially some of those curveballs that all of a sudden start coming your way. You know, we had the issue of the non-compliant EMTs, like the issue of the USDT. We have the issue of the PSD2. So it is indeed quite challenging. It is also quite challenging for international groups which operate in different markets. And in there, the regulatory regime, it's either not as mature as the one of the EU, or it has completely different dimensions. Like, for example, the way stable coins are being treated, like this issue of the EMTs. So when it comes to actually implementing, designing products and designing frameworks which apply on a global level, it is indeed quite challenging.
Yes, that's the thing. And if you're going to have shared resources, shared product, shared platform, you have to stay coming up with strategies, how you're going to roll out things to comply with everywhere you're operating. And Galyna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so basically, me as a senior associate, part of the Fintech team at WH Partners, obviously, we primarily advise crypto asset service providers, different financial institutions, and in general, innovative fintechs on regulatory compliance. Obviously, being part, we're advising also on licensing, on the transitioning as well when it comes to the current VFA service providers. And yes, I completely agree with Maruska that at first when we look at MiCA, even though it's quite a lengthy regulation, but we thought it was quite straightforward. It was very similar to the VFA framework that we used to have in Malta. But then, as with all these new guidelines and RTSs and implemented regulations and delegated regulations that are coming into force and like even just being established literally almost every month, and at some point this year, almost every week, we're just becoming overwhelmed. And let's be honest, we were expecting those because MiCA mentioned that indeed there would be guidelines, there would be certain RTSs implemented, but we were just not expecting how burdensome they would be. So they're quite heavy. This is not what we were expecting, not what industry in general was expecting. And obviously, on top of that, for example, when they issue certain guidelines, the interpretation that is being implemented in those guidelines is also something that was not expected, something completely surprising for the industry. So it's very then difficult to adapt, and obviously having a number of clients whom you need to advise, whom you always need to remember, need to be always alerted, and in order to advise them and guide them accordingly so that they remain compliant and fulfill obviously their obligations as the licensees.
Yes, I agree. Sometimes even as one DBA are unsure of something after it's published, so as advisors it becomes extremely difficult. Delphine, do you have anything to add?
Yes, so I agree with what everything has been said so far. Like I always call it a millefeuille. Here you have MiCA and then you have all the level 2 regulation, but there is not only the level 2 regulation where you may have EBA having opinions and ESPA saying something else, and maybe at the European level they disagree. Then at the national level, the way national competent authorities are interpreting the different guidelines might also differ from country A to B. But not only you have that, but then you have to comply with the transfer of fund regulation, with all the AML directive, with DORA that was mentioned previously by Camille, and we will talk about later on with the Payment Service Directive, right, which is, again, one more level. But maybe for me, more on a higher level, when we talk about what is the state of play of MiCA, I think MiCA is still a very young regulation, so we need to keep that in mind. It's been in force since January 1st, but because of the grandfathering period that is different from country A, B, C, D, we won't see any alignment before at least 18 months. It's very new. It has to settle, right? It's like when you're doing a good wine, you need to let him breathe. So for MiCA, I think it's a little bit the same. But on my side, when I talk with regulators, they are very much focused on authorization. But I think the focus needs to shift to supervision and enforcement action. And why I'm saying that is like our clients, so I work with a number of CAS and exchanges, and they're really trying their best to be compliant with all the MiCA requirements. It has a high cost in terms of compliance, and their competitors are still those offshore exchanges. They're relying on reverse solicitation, which is, I'm sorry, it's not possible anymore to do that in a very compliant way. And my clients are just like, but why can they do that? And I cannot do it. And I'm like, well, MiCA is there if you want to respect it. This is the way it is. But in Europe, I think we need to see enforcement action. We need to see the regulator actually saying this is the law and you can't operate like that anymore, right?
No, I agree. And on that point, so there's, it's a new regulation, now it's taken off, everyone's sort of in transit, everyone's sort of going through some turbulence in some matter of form, and hopefully the end result will be harmonization and everyone operating in a legal, safe environment. So in terms of some behind the scenes, perhaps that you're either experiencing from your colleagues, from your clients, from whoever it is, what are some of the behind the scenes movements we are seeing in the market as a result of non-compliance or not being big enough, let's say, to comply? What is some of the negative or behind the scenes effect from MiCA? Is everyone managing to do their part and apply?
I think that what we've noticed is that obviously because of the amount of obligations that cusp they need to follow is that a lot of them would either, for example, they would have to cut certain services, certain activities that they used to provide before MiCA actually became completely applicable. So those services that you know, they would be kind of like a gray area, so they are not regulated, but obviously to be on a safe side, they would just completely, they would, oh, I think it would not.
It's telling them to tell their French and Dutch clients either to redeem their assets or they have to migrate the clients. So it's actually saying enforcement from regulators if the companies are not authorized in those jurisdictions to operate. So behind the scenes, there's a lot of movement for sure. And as you mentioned, MiCA doesn't seem to be as attractive for the smaller players, which brings me to my next question. So is MiCA friendly to startups, or has the regulation resulted in creating a harmonized playing field, but for the medium to large size player? And why is that? Could you sort of highlight some of the requirements which could be seen as an obstacle for entry to market by the smaller guys? Perhaps, Maruska, you were just telling me how much you had to beef up your team to transition from VFA to MiCA. Maybe that's a good starting point.
I think that in the financial services world, especially in the EU, there is no regulation nor no directive which really caters for small players. Even though there's the concept of proportionality, which is written in the law, in practical terms, you know, I never see that concept applying on a day-to-day basis. The costs are there because the regulatory requirements are quite tough. So I think that all industry players had to beef up their compliance, their risk, ICT security, especially due to DORA, beef up their governance structures, beef up the board of directors. Some of us had to add additional executive or non-executive directors who need to have the appropriate experience to be able to join these boards. All these obviously are barriers to entry, so a small entity might not necessarily be able to handle all these costs. And the option is that if you don't want to recruit internally, you would need to outsource. And another form of regulation then kicks in due to outsourcing. And all the time you need to have people who are able to oversee anything which you are outsourcing. So from my experience, unfortunately, no, I'm not seeing this space to be the space for very small entities, but you need to be of a sufficient size.
I agree. Do you have anything to add, Delphine or Galyna, on this point?
No, I fully agree. I think the 2 points was mentioned, substance and governance. Like I've been part in building up entities, and you really need to have like an org chart where you see like all the people that are there, and you have like 3 lines of defense most of the time are required. I mean, if you are a startup with 5 people, it's not possible to do it. You can't double act, the regulator will not like that. So I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Delphine and Maruska. And also another thing that I wanted to point out is, yes, for sure, like the governance, this is something that is definitely required. But if at least the governance, you can sort of build it up, you know, and this is usually allowed. Obviously, there would be some minimum requirements, but then you can build them up as operations grow, you know, that when it comes to DORA, there is nothing to build up. It has to be complied with by everyone, no matter what size you have, you know, what kind of operations you have. Those are strict. So I feel like DORA was literally just, it was the cherry on the top of all this, like, over regulatory requirements, yes.
Yes, agreed. On the substance and the governance, quite heavy. And as you know, there's about 2,000 or 3,000 casps operating under some AML registration regime, which is just sort of a one-man band. So I doubt that most of them or all of them will have the cost to capacity to employ 5, 6, 7, 8 people. So it will be interesting to see who makes it to the June deadline and how many players will actually be authorized in the end. I'd like to ask a question to you, Delphine. So when it comes to product development, how and why do you think that product development and compliance teams should work together, or product managers should be used by compliance teams? This in the context of understanding the licensable activities and also to ensure you are building compliance products?
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a really key question, because most of the time, product and business see compliance as a no-go, but this is not the case. Compliance is here to enable the business. And I've been working in crypto for around 9 years now, and the first company I was working for was an exchange. And your compliance, no one wants to talk with you, so they avoid discussing with you. And then you arrive at the end, and they're like, so, Delphine, look, this is the product we are ready to launch tomorrow. And I'm like, not like that, guys. And basically, you have a product team in that case that will work on a product for 6 months. They never talk to compliance. They think they can launch without having a license. And it's not the case. But as a compliance and legal officer, my role is to help them and tell them. They're going to tell me, this is the product, this is my customer, this is what I want to do in the future. And I will say, okay, what is your budget? And some will say, okay, I have a very small budget. And I will say, okay, if we build the product in that direction, then maybe you don't need a license now, and you can start launching your product next month. And then you ramp up, depending on the budget, they will raise money, and then you can ramp up like that. And I think it's really important to work end by end with the product manager and the product team, but also with the development team. Because it's the same as a compliance person. Tomorrow there is a new regulation, and I need to be able to make sure that the company complies with it, but I need to make sure that my tech stack is flexible and modular enough. I'm going to give you an example. You're an exchange, you onboard people from all over the world, but depending on where the customer is located and depending on which entity is going to onboard the customer, the customer journey is going to be different. If you look at the UK right now, in the UK, if you want to onboard a retail customer, you will need to go through a knowledge test, appropriateness test, 24 hours cooling period. If I onboard a customer in Switzerland, I need to get my customer to do a full video identification, meaning I speak with the customer. It's not like a liveness text and these kind of things. So my tech stack needs to be super modular, and you need to be able to turn on and turn off certain customer journey as well as certain module. And sometimes when you talk with your tech guys, they are like, no, it's not possible. I'm like, well, we need to do business, guys, right? So I think it's really important to always see compliance as a business enabler. We also want the business to prosper. It's in the interest of everybody, and we want to make sure that the company is going to comply, right?
No, I agree. I think product is sort of, as a position, sometimes really undermined. But even as an advisor, someone will come up to me, I'd like to apply for a CASP license or an EMI license. And I said, okay, can you draw your flow, sort of the flow of funds, the chain of parties, sort of explain to me the activity that you're carrying out? And very, very often, clients will not be able to draw their own diagram of the flow of activities, to be able to classify their own services and activity. And that is where, sort of, if you have a product manager or a head of product, they will be super useful as well. What are you doing? Are you licensable or not? I'd like to touch upon a question that you mentioned briefly before in terms of global operators. So how can global operators build and roll out products and services globally in this realm of varying different regulatory regimes across the globe? So what strategies and processes are being adopted in the market by these global players?
From my experience, it's always becoming more complex given the fact that different jurisdictions are coming out with different regulatory regimes. I think that the majority of the reputable jurisdictions now have their own frameworks, some quite well advanced like MiCA, others still early days. So for global players, it's becoming much more complex. I think that there are a couple of key points that these global players need to have. So primarily, definitely you need to have local compliance officers who are based locally, who have experience of how the regulator is interpreting certain clauses within the law. I mean, one thing is, like, for example, having worked in MiCA, with MiCA, but another thing is actually having worked here in Malta to understand the Maltese regulatory environment, what's accepted, what's not accepted. Also, it all boils down to a lot of communication, which unfortunately with global companies is difficult because of different cultures, different expectations, different time zones as well. But communication and research is also very, very important in my opinion.
Anything to add from?
Yes, I think more, again, on an overview point of view, when you have to navigate in a global world, and everyone knows that cryptocurrencies are born global and digital, what is super important is to have a global regulatory strategy in place. And what I mean by the global regulatory strategy in place is something that is really important is to know who are your customers, where are your customers located. So you will have an Excel spreadsheet or whatever you want to use, where you can see the top 10 countries per number of customers, but also the most important is the top 10 countries by revenue. And then you will monitor, let's say, country 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is one is Hong Kong, one is Singapore, one is Panama, one is the Seychelles, number 6 is Cyprus. And then you will have a plan and say if X, Y, Z regulation is happening, this is the plan, because the regulation, when it's made, it's entered into force, but generally you have some time to comply. And then you will need to make that approved by your board, because sometimes you will say, well, if X, Y, Z happen, I don't care, I will not do anything, risk accept, right? But when you're accepting a risk, you're obviously taking a risk, because things are not always super clear. And I think it's very important to have this visibility to know exactly what is going to happen. Because if a country represents 20% of your business and suddenly there is a regulation happening, you absolutely need to have a license. You need to be ready for that. Or you need to say, well, I'm going to lose this one, but my plan B is to go that direction, right? And I think it's super important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what is important is to have the clear, target jurisdictions, as Delphine mentioned, and then just to, obviously you can have actual entities in a couple of jurisdictions, to have a group, but then also important to have just target jurisdictions, which you can also potentially target from all other jurisdictions where you have a local substance, and monitor it constantly to ensure that nothing new is coming up, so that in order to stay compliant.
No, I agree. There's a lot of different components to consider. Reverse solicitation, do I need a new license over there? Can I have the same website? Do I need to geo-block any specific residence? So there's a lot of things to consider, and it's the more places you target, the more license you have, the more complicated I guess it gets. But that's the price of doing business. I'd like to touch up a bit on the topic of the EBA interplay opinion. So this is for you, Galyna, as a fellow advisor. So midway through the full transition into MiCA, which for all companies and CASPs is June of next year, quite soon, the EBA, so the European Banking Authority, has decided to throw a spanner into the works. In comes the publication of a letter issued by the EBA on the interplay between MiCA and PSD2. So this essentially states that if you're a CASP, so a crypto operator, and you are carrying out the licensable service of transfer or custody of e-money tokens, so stable coins like USDC, you now also fall under the PSD2 regulatory framework, and you'll also need to obtain a PSP license by March of next year. So this is even before the CASP deadline. So Galyna, from your experience so far, do operators understand the importance of this letter which was issued? And what happens if they do miss this March 2026 deadline to obtain a PSP license to cover these two licensable activities? Or are people still under shock?
I think, yes. A lot of people are still under shock, including me most probably as well, because the deadline is quite tight. And another obviously issue, sort of, to put it that way, is that it was just a legal opinion that was issued by the EBA. Again, unfortunately, we were lacking a direct instruction that, guys, if you do this, 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 and that, you need to have this and that. It was maybe, might be, case-by-case basis. So, again, there is no clarity, but then obviously there are those that obviously would just disregard it and come back to it later, but then there would be those that would start panicking because they would need to reassess their entire activities, their entire operations, and also to apply for another license. It's not a joke. Even if their ABA is saying that there would be a possibility of having this limited license, still there are still prudential requirements enforced. There are still governance requirements. There is still a number of policies and procedures that need to be placed. It's not just something, like an additional activity that you are adding to your CASP license. So
Yes.
it's tough. It's another burden, let's put it that way.
And you, Maruska, how are you? Does your company carry out transfer of custody of EMTs, and are you applying for this limited PSP license? What's your experience?
Yes, definitely. We need this license, and we're working towards it. I think that we are beyond the stage of shock, and possibly some of us are in a state of denial, questioning whether this is the right treatment or not, especially given that in other jurisdictions they're not applying similar treatments, and in global companies like FalconX, you'd need to make comparisons between different jurisdictions. But definitely we're moving on with applying for the license. The CASP's license obviously is taking much more priority, but the deadline is fast approaching. So we're looking into the additional regulatory burden, the costs that there are behind it, and also making sure that all the controls are in place. So it's quite tough.
In reality, companies just don't have a choice. If you're doing those two services and you want to continue operating, you need to apply for this license. So the only positive thing is that if you are operating in Malta, the MFSA has taken a more proactive approach instead of a reactive approach, and it is introducing this limited PSP license for these two overlap services, and there will be sort of a solution for those CASPs to try and make the deadline to make sure they can continue to operate. So pleasure's yet to come. So just moving towards the last question, which I will direct at you, Delphine, since it's your bread and butter at Solidus Labs. So MiCA introduces comprehensive rules for CASPs on consumer protection. How do you see these rules impacting market integrity in practice, particularly in the light of preventing market abuse and fostering investor confidence without stifling innovation? And what are some popular tools used in the market for market abuse and transaction monitoring, and who is using them?
Cool, thank you for the question. So for the audience, we're talking about MiCA Title 6, which is on the prevention and prohibition of market abuse. And it's one of the first time in the world that there's actually comprehensive regulation about market abuse and preventing it. It applies to persons professionally arranging and executing trade in crypto assets. So the scope is way larger than CASP. So if you're market makers, you're in scope. You're a broker dealer, you're in scope. Exchanging, you're in scope. Anyway, if you're arranging transactions in crypto assets, you're in scope. And I think it's very important. And it's really important that we have such a regulation because, I don't know if you guys know about crypto, but the crypto world has been rigged by wash trading, front running, and this is not good for the industry. I mean, as an industry, we want to attract the right players, and if we really want to look serious, we need to have controls in place. And I'm always shocked, to see, I live in Switzerland, and in Switzerland, well, market abuse does not apply to crypto. So in Switzerland, well, you can still do wash trading, it's all good. And this is really crazy because at the end of the day, those regulations are here to protect the customer so that they can have fair pricing, so they can trade in a market where they are safe and protected, but for every player. So I think it's really important. So here at Solidus Labs, we provide market surveillance systems, and we actually work with regulators. So we just signed a contract with ESMA, which is a European securities regulator, and we were going to work with all the NCAs inside the EU. So it's really cool. I'm very excited about that because it means that the regulator is also taking it seriously, and we're going to see, I guess, enforcement action as soon as they are able to, use our tool and get used to it. And I'm really excited about that because I'm very passionate about crypto, and I want the crypto industry to have a good reputation. I don't want to see us always in the news because there is pump dumps, scams, or wash trading here and there. It's really important to be able to provide safe and orderly market.
Perfect, thank you. Do you use any market surveillance tools at FalconX? I'm guessing you do by law. All right.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
They use us.
I was not going to say that, but it's true.
I don't want to put you on the spot in case you don't. Okay, so I'm mindful of the time and that we lost 5 minutes due to the technical issue, so I'll conclude over here. I hope you enjoyed it and you got some value from the session, and thanks for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference.